Prince George's County Public School family. Thank you for joining me for the first of many workshops and series that we will have around race, diversity, and cultural respect. I'm thankful for the opportunity for us to have courageous conversations and to be vulnerable about ways that we can improve our own actions and beliefs in order to improve the opportunities that we provide to over 136,000 families and students. I'm grateful for the many emails that you sent, sharing your personal experiences and asking for an opportunity to make sure that we grow as individuals and as a community and organization for our commitment to improve educational experiences for all. This summer, I will also have a movie series, a book series, and we'll continue to provide opportunities for us to openly have discussions about ways that we can address our own implicit bias that we may not even know that we have, and talk about the ways that our own personal experiences help to shape and form the way that we treat each other. Please join me as we begin this walk together. Know that we're never too old to learn, and we're doing this to make sure that the lives of our children are so much better than what we're experiencing today across the nation. Have a great day, and please enjoy this professional development experience.
Good morning. My name is David Reese from the Office of Equity and Excellence here in the Prince George's County Public School System. I'm excited to be here with you all this morning to begin part one of looking at identity and bias in the workplace. I know that many of you have received the emails from Dr. Goldson where she's talked about her push for the system to engage in courageous conversations about race and bias and how our biases impact our work environment. In order to begin robust work in our system around bias, though, we first have to start with identity. And that is looking very in depth at who we are, what our backgrounds are, and how our individual cultures have shaped how we think. Many people have heard people talk about the concept of bias. And here recently, we've heard people mention things like implicit bias or unconscious bias. So before we begin looking at our work today, I want to take a moment to define what unconscious bias is. So what exactly is implicit bias? First, it has some synonyms. You'll often hear people refer to it as unconscious bias or hidden bias. And these biases come about when people have a negative association with a person or group, and they often don't know that they have that particular negative association. These negative associations can be expressed automatically and often without our awareness, which is what makes them unconscious. What's really powerful about implicit bias and implicit biases is that they can override a person's stated beliefs. For example, I remember a time when I was doing my student teaching in North Carolina, and my supervising teacher was collecting some data on my lesson. And at the end of the lesson, he asked me about, my calling patterns regarding calling on different students. And I said, I'm sure I called on young men and young women pretty much about the same because, I couldn't imagine that I would favor one group over the other. When he showed me the data, it was clear that at 80% of the time, I actually called on boys and then called on girls 20% of the time. When confronted with that data, I had to ask myself what was going on with my calling patterns and what might be represented by this data that I was unaware of. This could be an example of me having an unconscious bias as a teacher, and maybe it was about the eagerness of the boys and how they raised their hand or where they sat in the classroom, but for some reason the data were clear. They had more opportunities to speak and participate in class than girls. The fact that I had someone who was willing to share that data with me so that I could reflect on my practice made this unconscious bias conscious. And once I became aware of it, I was then empowered to do something differently. As we're beginning to engage in a system-wide effort to confront our unconscious or implicit bias in Prince George's County, it's first important to start with identity, as I already expressed, but many people believe that it's important to start at the top. And that's exactly where we're going to start today. Yesterday, I had the privilege of facilitating a conversation about identity with Dr. Goldson and her executive cabinets. And these are the executive level leaders who who are responsible for the divisions in the school district. I was able to join them in their meeting and lead them through a protocol called Circles of My Multicultural Self, where they were able to reflect on aspects of their identity by naming aspects of their identity on a diagram. And then I moved them through a protocol where I asked them to share a story of a time when they were especially proud of one of those identities. Next, they discussed a pain point that they experienced in their lives connected to one of those identities, and we had a conversation about that. And finally, we wrapped up with a conversation about stereotypes and our experiences with stereotypes connected to our identities. We're about to show you an example of this conversation that played out in the fishbowl yesterday. And as you observe it, I want you to take out a piece of paper or use your cell phone, however you want to jot down a couple of notes, and just write down what's coming up for you, or think about connections that you have to what you hear our executive leader sharing. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being willing to participate in the Circles of My Multicultural Self activity. As you all are very well aware, in Prince George's County, we're about to engage in systemic professional learning connected to all aspects of equity that will allow us to have deep and meaningful conversations, courageous conversations about race, racism, bias, and the implications that has for us as leaders who are working with each other in the school district who support children. But before we engage in any of those types of conversations, it is first important to be clear about identity, and that is who we are and the complexity that surrounds each person's unique individual background. This activity is designed to allow each of us the opportunity to explore our identity and aspects of it, and then begin learning how to share about that as we hear about that from others, about identities from other people. So each of you has a sheet of paper, and if you don't have it in front of you, that's fine, because I'm going to pull it up on my screen here, and it says Circles of My Multicultural Self. In short, what you would do is first, in the center satellite of the center circle, you can write your name or however you like to be identified. I will put David or David Jr. or Junebug, depending on my context, because my family called me Junebug growing up. And then in the satellite circles, you would add aspects of your identity that are important to you. Now, you might have more than 4, so feel free to add additional circles. They can be satellites off of a main circle, or you can add additional ones. And I want to give you time to fill in aspects of your identity that are important to you. The second 2 instructions are to, after you have those identities filled in, to share a story. And you might just write down some quick notes around a time when you were proud, especially proud, of one of those descriptors. And then item number 2 says, share a story about a time when it was especially painful to be identified with one of those descriptors. And I'm going to ask, when we come back together, for individuals to share to her or his level of comfort. So I'll just pause for a moment to give us some opportunity to think about how we want to identify ourselves and then highlights of those stories. If there's anyone who would like to share aspects of her or his satellite circle, please go ahead and do so now. And if you wouldn't mind, just share your identity satellite circles, and then talk to us about your story of pride and your story of pain.
I will begin. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, Kyra. And my circles are, I'm a female, I'm a sister, and then I'm the youngest sibling. I'm a mom of a child with autism, and I'm a coworker. A time that I was especially proud is when my son, who has autism, was a toddler, And at the time, some people were diagnosing, were giving him the diagnostic. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't talk. They were saying that he couldn't do certain things at that time. And over the years, he was able to master certain things. He was able to overcome certain things. And every time he was able to overcome whatever it was that the person at the time said that he couldn't do, it just made me proud as a mom. And then a story about a painful identifier is being the youngest sibling and having to care for elderly parents. And usually it's the oldest child that is the caregiver, decision maker, the one who's the most responsible. But that burden fell on me. And it was painful because a lot of times I needed my older siblings to step in to assist me, to help me, and they weren't there for me. And so I had to carry that burden. Is that good? Want me to do it over?
Fine. Thank you for sharing. Someone else.
Good morning. I'm willing to share my multicultural story. My name is Gwendolyn Mason, and I am certainly a proud African American female. I'm also the mother of 2 sons. That's another category. I consider myself a caregiver, an educator, and from a spiritual perspective, I am Christian. I'd like to begin, however, by sharing what I'm most proud of. My oldest son is 32 years old, so that means that some 32 years ago, I really became just extraordinarily proud of giving birth to my oldest son, who I feel has grown into be a very fine young man, where his dad and I have worked hard to instill in him the values of respect, a love for education, a love for God, a love for humanity, and most importantly, a love for education. And because that is one of the proudest aspects of my journey, but I will say from the perspective of painful, that while I worked hard to raise my son to be an individual who would have those attributes, I remember when he was in middle school, and there's a particular story in which I received a phone call and a note from a teacher who was upset that my oldest son did not bring some index cards to class. And obviously he had been asked to do so for a number of days. I didn't know that. When I called the teacher, who was an educator like myself, she said, "Oh, I'm so surprised that you called me." And I knew then, in speaking to that fellow educator, that I was dealing with an educator who had implicit bias, saw my son not as simply a student in her class who failed to be organized, who failed to follow through with a particular task, but just saw him as a young man who was probably associated with a family who maybe just didn't have a value for education, didn't have parents who would be supportive. And when that educator made that statement to me, I must admit that I gave that particular teacher a history lesson. I let her know that my family, I represent the 4th generation of an educator in my family, and that where my son lives actually happened to be in the community where the homes were significantly larger and more expensive than the community where the school was actually located. And the simple fact that he didn't have index cards just simply meant that he was being a quirky little 8th grader at that particular time and had nothing to do with the values that his family has around the field of education. While I asserted myself that day, I do remember the pain that I felt because I felt that there would be other children and other parents who would be disrespected by an educator. And being an educator, I've worked hard to try to respect families and to respect children. That was a painful day, but I also think it was a teachable moment for this particular teacher and will make her think about having that kind of conversation again with another parent whom she assumed, because they were African American, would not value education or respond to a school's needs or concerns.
And thank you for sharing.
I'll go. Is it okay?
Absolutely.
Sure. So my name's Christian, and on my circles I have Black, man, father, and husband. And my most proud moment is actually when I became a father for the first time with my son, Christian Jr. And there's the immediate kind of proudness of being a dad, but it was related to people in my life were my father and my grandfather. And I had the blessing of having extremely great examples of what my father was in my family. The images that I saw outside of my family did not always represent which is that we're present and helped me become the man I am. The most painful moment, and I've shared this with some of my colleagues, was really related to being Black and being Black in North Carolina, South. My mother and my dad, who's in the Army, moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina, and we were at a piece goods store, which was a fabric store my mom liked to sew. And we came from New Jersey and Philadelphia. So when we moved to North Carolina, I'm 7 years old. We're standing in line. My mom goes to pay for the fabric that she bought with a check. And the check, she wrote it. It was like $21. And the cashier at that store looked at my mother, turned the check on the back side, and wrote BLK woman, Black woman, on the back of that check. My mother noticed that, and I noticed it. And she asked, "Why did you write that on the back of my check?" And the cashier, nonchalantly and really not knowing that was a problem, said, "That's just store policy." And my mom, being the educated woman she was, did not accept that answer. But it was the first time that I realized that I was Black and that there was a different treatment of Black people, particularly in the South. And it stuck with me for the rest of my life. It's one of the reasons why I moved to Prince George's County, because at least in this county, I'm not reminded daily of my race. But in North Carolina, where I'm from and where I claim, it was a daily reminder that I was a Black man in the South. And that reminder was something that was extremely painful. And frankly, it's one of my mom's most painful memories because she had to endure that with me present. She was holding my hand, trying to hold her dignity, and recognizing that she was judged just because she was a Black woman. So that's my story. Thank you.
My name is Helen, and the categories that I've chosen that best describe me are that of a mother of two, a wife, a sister. I am the oldest of three girls. And of course, I'm an African American educator. And I know there were only four, but I'm also a Christian. In reflecting upon each of those areas, the story and the one that I'm most proud of is definitely to be the mother of the two children that I have. In addition to my husband, who might get a little jealous. Proud and adore that too, but I also am the mother of two that I extremely adore. One of the, it's very interesting to come to the one about sharing a experience that had been one that was associated with pain. And that was when I was an educator and I was a preschool teacher in Hanau, Germany. And I tell this story over and over again as if it were occurring today, because it can never leave me. And I think about it certainly in moments of time as we are currently going through now, where one morning, typically as a preschool teacher, you have your circle time for your students to convene in the morning for your pre-work, where you're singing your songs, doing your rhymes, going through the calendar and such. And I noticed that there were two students. There was an African-American student and a Caucasian student, two little boys. And I noticed during that time that they continued to try to, the African American student would get closer to the Caucasian student, but the closer the Caucasian student would get to the African American student, he would move away. So I was like, well, what is going on here? So after circle time, as they go into their seats, I asked both of them to come up, and I asked both of them, what is going on in here this morning? Why are you all acting and treating each other the way that you are? And the Caucasian student told me, my father, now this is in the early 80s, my father told me that I'm not to be close to or sit beside any student that's Black. I'm like, Lord have mercy. I said, I'm Black. What do you, and you never given me that type of treatment, but I'm following what my father told me to do. And I said, well, in here, we're all treated equal. Everybody treats everyone respectful. And I was, if you don't want to be his friend, we got into that discourse. But I knew that my next moment was going to be, I need to have a conversation with this young man's father. Because his father, he said his father told him. So I want to hear from his father what his perspective is for this. Of course, the father said, I never told him that. Well, what we do know, and it's amazing, I just recently heard Spike Lee reference it as well. Those behaviors are learned behaviors. Individuals are not born to treat each other with disrespect, as I saw that morning in that classroom in Hanau, Germany. And again, in the early 80s. So that was painful for me as an educator, because as I see children, and as I've been an educator for all these years, I don't see color. I see the needs of students, addressing their social, emotional, and developmental needs. And it really resonated with me then, even though I grew up in North Carolina as well and shared some of the same types of situations as described previously by a colleague. But to actually see that, and these were 4-year-old children, to this day, I still reflect upon that moment. So that is my story.
So I am Jewish, progressive, not just politically, but I like to really move things forward whenever possible and genuinely like change. I am socially awkward, as you've all seen at times. Get very anxious about things, overthink everything. And it's to the point where it's really part of my personality and even my identity. And I am a policy nerd. I like to talk about big issues and the best way to solve them. I like disagreeing with smart people, and helps me to really further develop how I think about things. And that's really one of the reasons that I like working here at PGCPS, getting the opportunity to do that. In terms of, I'm especially proud, kind of weirdly proud of my social awkwardness now, because I'm in a job where I regularly regularly speak to groups of people. I still get anxious and overthink things, but every time I present, I don't have a full-on panic attack anymore. So it's some progress. Especially painful. My Jewishness, I think, was especially painful. One story is when the Holocaust Museum in DC first opened, we took my grandma out there. She was a librarian herself, and she, as I've told some of you before, she escaped as a Jewish orphan. She escaped Berlin when she was 9 years old, right before, or really during the Holocaust. And with the help of some librarians at that museum, when we took her out there, she was able to find out what had happened to her grandfather, who had helped raise her, and some of the friends that she had. And the actual results she found out were much sadder than she had expected. So I think just being the same age then when I went with her as when she left Germany, it was kind of a window into a pain that I really hadn't experienced in my life in my own childhood.
I like to go. So in my circles, I have female, African American, single mom, Christian, and I added one educator. And I have lots of moments that I'm proud of, but one of them is when people ask me where I went to school. I have 3 degrees and I went to 3 HBCUs. historically Black colleges and universities, and that was by choice. My first experience in a HBCU was so great and helped to shape me into who I believe I am now. And because of that, I wanted that continuity of learning in the same type of environment. And then when it was time for me to get my doctorate, and there were several choices, I knew that I only applied to one place because I wanted to get into Howard University and be amongst people that I knew I could have very candid conversations about ways that I could propel the community that I serve all the time. So I'm extremely proud of my three HBCUs, Florida A&M, Bowie State, and Howard University. And a painful time was when I came home from undergrad and was looking for a job. On my way to a job interview, elderly woman was walking, and she had a paper bag with groceries in it, but the bag tore. So all the groceries fell out on the ground, and lots of people just walked past her. But I felt compelled to stop and help her. I mean, she just looked helpless. So I stopped to help her and to find a way to put her groceries in some kind of way so that she could get home. But at any rate, I ended up being late to the interview because I made a choice to stop. And when I got there, I figured, okay, I'll just let them know what happened. And when I got there, the guy who received me in the reception areas, he was taking me back to the interview, said to me, well, it looks like you were on CP time. And CP time, for people who don't know, means colored people's time. And I was so taken aback and flustered that, one, it came out of his mouth. It was someone who was not of color who said it to me. And I knew right then I didn't want to work for that company. But of course, you know, I was raised where my mom taught me, all you have is your name, so you don't go out there and embarrass me. So I went into the interview and completed the interview and got the job. It felt so good to be able to tell them, no, I didn't want it and why. But at that moment walking in, I was flustered. I couldn't believe that someone would just say out of their mouth, it looks like you're on CP time, when all I did was stop to help someone. Like, I could have been like everyone else and walked away.
Now that you've seen the executive leaders share aspects of their identity, as well as points of pain and pride connected to their identities, remember that I asked you to think about connections that you had or what might have resonated with you. I'm sure there might have been some surprising things that you heard, and then you might have felt some level of emotion around what you were hearing our leaders share. For example, Dr. Libby identified herself as a mom, and as the mom of a child with autism, and what it meant to be a mom of a child who had special needs, and the joy that she felt when she watched him overcome things that some didn't think he would be able to achieve. You heard our chief financial officer have a conversation about his religion, and he explicitly named that he was Jewish, and it is a point of pride for him and his identity. It's important in Prince George's County that we begin to name our identities out loud and share that with others so they understand more about us and more about what shapes our beliefs and know what's important to us. In a survey that went out a couple days ago, we asked you all to think about aspects of your identity that were important to you. And I'll be honest, I definitely made some choices around which categories I included, and there were some that were not included. And thank you all for your feedback around how to become more inclusive around categories that matter to you, and we'll talk about that momentarily. But I do want to share with you some of the data from your survey. And at this point, we've had over 8,000 people respond to the 6 questions in the survey. When asked, what aspects of your identity matter most to you, here are the data that you all came up with. Most of you ranked family status, being a spouse, parent, potentially child, as what's most important to you, followed by religion, race, gender, and then career, job, or profession. Next, I thought it would be important to share with you what you all thought was second most important. And whereas family status was the most important for 33% of people, it was second most important for 27% of people, followed by gender, career, job or profession, religion, and then race. I'll be honest with you. Because race would be my number one, I assumed that more people, like more than half of the people, would respond to the survey having race as their top identified choice. But the data that I got back did not confirm the belief that I thought that I had. Most of you have something more important to you than it is to me, and that is okay. But that is an important data point for me to consider as I engage with you all as my colleagues. So thank you all for taking that survey and giving us that data. We'll have a lot of opportunities as we move forward to unpack what this data means when you work with your school teams or your district teams as you continue to do work where you engage with exploring your identities and what it means for you. We asked the question, to what extent do you feel that aspects of your identity that are important to you are both understood and valued by your colleagues? Here's what the data say. 8% of you said it's not important at all. On the other hand, the overwhelming majority of us felt that it was very important that aspects of our identity be understood and valued by our colleagues. What better way of ensuring that people understand and value our identities than taking the opportunity to talk about what our identities are and what they mean for us, why we are proud of the aspects of who we are, and how sometimes there's pain associated with being identified with a group that is a part of our identity. In order to dig a little bit more deeply, we move back to our circles of multicultural self-activity, and then we engage in the conversation about stereotypes. Next, you'll see the fishbowl, where I actually introduce and model for the team how to make a statement connected to a stereotype from those circles of my multicultural self handout. And I want you to pay attention to what happens in the room as our leaders begin to share. The next portion is number 3. And it says, name a stereotype associated with one of the groups with which you identify that is not consistent with who you are. And I will give you all a quick model for what that might look like. So if I would have shared aspects of my circle, I probably would have put a son of parents from the rural South, from Alabama, that I am a Black American man, and that I'm a first-generation college student. And the stereotypes actually flip for me. Because on the one hand, I grew up in the absolute poorest community in Cleveland, Ohio, where access was not something that most of us benefited from. There were no AP classes. The majority of us didn't graduate from high school, and that is still a point of pain for me. So whereas I did grow up poor, and I did have a mom who was on welfare at one point in her life, I am that, but I'm also not undereducated and any less deserving of the full rights that American citizens and American residents should have. But then on the flip side, I attended 3 universities that have some of the largest endowments in the nation. And when people hear about the schools that I went to, they can climb the ladder of inference and make lots of assumptions. So yes, I am Ivy League educated, and I am not born with a silver spoon in my mouth and completely detached from what poor people need. So that would be the stereotype statement that I would share. And I just want to give you all a moment to just think about connecting the dots between an aspect of your identity and a stereotype, and then we'll hear out from you.
Good morning. My name is Christy, and I put in my circle that I'm funny, intense, reflective, and an only child. And that's probably why I think I'm funny, because I often entertain myself. I put that the one that, for the subject line, that I am intense, but that and oftentimes that translates in the position that I'm in an operational function, to be an angry Black woman. And I'm by far not angry. I am intense and I have high expectations, but I'm not angry. And it's interesting because I actually think I'm funny. So to have the perception that my intensity is that I'm an angry Black woman, or often, being upfront and honest, referred to as a female dog because of that intensity. And I'm neither of those. So it's very interesting being in education that women dominate the educational classroom by 75%, but only less than 10% of women in education aspire to higher level positions such as chiefs, associate superintendents, or the superintendency. So I'm in a male dominated class in my profession of education, and that often translates to having a derogatory name, which is really not who I am.
I can go next, David. One of my identifiers was father, and I have two wonderful daughters and two wonderful sons, and they're actually 20 years apart. And for that statement, I stated I am a father, but not an absentee father. And the perception, often, unfortunately, of fathers, and particularly African-American fathers, is that they are potentially absentee, and that has never been me. And my children would certainly tell you that their current and continued success is due to me being their dad. And also, the reflection of that, I recall growing up in Washington, D.C., when my mom and dad bought their first home in 1960, and I was 8 years old. And that was in an area of D.C. And when I got to that neighborhood, and my dad was 34 years old at that time, had served in the Army, used the VA bill to buy the home, that neighborhood was full completely of moms and dads, African American. And those dads were present. They raised all of us as a community. And that is, truly the symbol of what carried me, forward.
Yeah, my circle, this is Barry, was African American, Black, man, husband, father. The stereotype that bothered me throughout my career is, one, I'm an African American male, but because I was in criminal justice, law enforcement most of my career, I've constantly said I'm not a criminal. And people get surprised when you say, just because I'm a Black man, not every Black man is a criminal. But this protest has caught me off guard a little bit. And I say that in the sense is I've arrested a lot of African American men in Frederick County, where I'm from. I've dealt with the KKK, who said, why is a African American young male, Black male, working in the sheriff's office, when that barely happened back in 1979 when I came up. The other thing is that bothered me, coming to Prince George's County, running the Department of Corrections, I dealt with a lot of African American men locked up. And so with that, it bothered me, because most of the time you were trying to find a way to help people to stay out of jail. And to see the protest, people protesting against police, this last 2 weeks told me there is truth behind that, because I've seen it in my whole career, just about, in law enforcement. So when I say I'm African American and male and I'm not a criminal, I'm really trying to say that not everybody that's locked up is really a criminal. People just had tough times. So this protest has caught me off guard a little bit. So that's my story.
I'll speak up. My name is Raven. And my identifiers were Black woman, daughter, and Chicagoan. And being a Chicagoan and specifically a South Sider has become a point of pride to me. And I really associate it more with Michelle Obama than anything else, and just her emphasis on being proud of your story and learning to love your story. And one of the stereotypes that I try to fight against, that Chicago's a very segregated city. Neighborhoods are very Black and very white. You don't have a lot of mixed income or mixed race communities. And so one of the stereotypes I try to fight against, though, is that a Black community means that it's an unsafe community. I try to educate people on what happens when you disinvest in minority communities, but they're not unsafe because they're Black.
You just heard several of our colleagues reflect about their experiences with stereotypes. Our Chief of Human Resources, Christy Murphy, discussed what it means to be a woman who's intense, and sometimes that intensity has a negative derogatory word attached to it. Mr. Burnett is a father, yet he's not an absentee father. And we heard from Raven Hill, who talked about her experience as a woman who grew up in Chicago in a Black community and how lots of people attach unsafety to Black. I now want to introduce a concept to us that you might have heard people talk about in the news or hearing people tweet about. And I want to spend some time defining it and showing us how it connects to identity, bias, and stereotypes. The term is microaggression. So what is a microaggression? A microaggression is the everyday verbal or nonverbal slights, snubs, or insults, whether they are intentional or unintentional, that communicate negative messages to people based on their identity. One of the reasons why it's important to share who we are, why we value who we are as it connects to our identity, and name the negative stereotypes that impact us, is so that we can help ourselves and others become consciously aware of statements and actions that people have made about us based off of our identities that can become a microaggression. What we really want to work to do is make the unconscious, those things that we don't know about, conscious. And the best way of doing that is to name it. Sometimes it is difficult, painful, and emotional to talk about times when your stereotypes about you have had a negative impact on who you are. But it is very important that we create the culture in Prince George's County where we can talk openly about those, because it helps everyone get better. In a survey question, we asked, in the past year, how often have you heard statements from colleagues that point to a stereotype about someone's identity that was problematic? The overwhelming majority said rarely or sometimes do they hear those statements, yet 34% of you said this happens about 4 to 7 times a year, and several people stated that this happens multiple times, it's too many to count, and that it's consistent and it's normal to hear these kinds of statements. Connected to that, we wanted to learn more about your level of comfort having direct conversations to challenge or confront and address the statements that you heard. 43% of us were somewhat comfortable in some situations, but stated that there were times when you chose to remain silent. And 8% of us in Prince George's County were extremely uncomfortable confronting these instances. We're glad that you were transparent in sharing your thoughts and ideas with us via the survey. We also offered you the opportunity to provide us with some open-end responses about how you were feeling about the work that we were about to engage in and some hopes that you have for what our system might do. I want to reflect to you some of the themes that we received from the thousands of responses that you gave us. Regarding what you desire, resoundingly, we recognize that we want to have continuous work with identity, bias, equity, and cultural competency. Many of you wanted to be assured that this will not just happen once, but will be a part of continuous professional learning so that we could have a much more professional culture that values all aspects of diversity. Immigration, how we treat newcomers, and what we think about their possibilities was another theme that stood out clearly in the data, and we wanted to have a culture of being culturally responsive. Last, as we continue in the continuous work, people wanted school-wide and team-wide conversations about implicit bias in their workplace environments. And then you all gave us some suggestions. In bold, you see the word truly. You want to truly have the Prince George's County culture where we embrace different perspectives and opinions to encourage dialogue. Some of you noted that the LGBTQ+ community was absent in the survey and know that this is a very important community to Prince George's County Public Schools and for adults and for students, and wanted us to consider that when we talk about bias. And several of you are professionals in the equity and equity work in your own regard and have lots of research ideas and best practices that you want to share. Be assured that we will continue to seek guidance from lots of us. Many of you wanted to share your ideas and research to support this work. Some of you have written dissertations, have done presentations, and have been deeply involved in work connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Know that we will be reaching out to you to gather some input from you about how we might move forward. And last, and I think this is extremely important, we wanted to remember to offer grace. There are times when having these types of dialogues can create emotion for people. And as a presenter of this work in other spaces, I know that there are times when people fear speaking because they might say something wrong, or they feel like they might be attacked or judged because of a statement that they've made that was from an emotional place. It is important to hold a space where we allow for learning to occur, which means people might make mistakes. And I strongly encourage your teams to develop norms around how you will engage with each other when you have conversations about bias and equity so that everyone leaves whole. Our office is committed to offering further guidance and resources to the system as we continue to embark on this journey. Know that this is just the beginning of our journey to become a much more equitable and inclusive school district. Your supervisors and principals will be connecting with you around next steps where you too will engage in the activity, Circles of My Multicultural Self, to begin your journeys identifying your identities and naming points of pride and pain connected to them and naming stereotypes so that your colleagues can hear and learn from you about your identity and your perspectives. We will now hear from Dr. Goldson, who has some exciting information to share.
Thank you for remaining engaged during our first professional development experience. I hope you learned a little bit more about some of the executive leadership team members in our fishbowl activity. You will have that opportunity to do that with your staff and departments before the beginning of the school year. I also want to share with you the book that I will be reading this summer that if you'd love to join, please feel free to do so. It's voluntary, and it's entitled Biased: Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do by Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt. You can also purchase this book on Amazon, a bookstore, or download in your Kindle, and we'll start the very first virtual book study experience on July 8th at 6 p.m. I hope you'll join me. This is only open to Prince George's County Public School employees. I will be pairing you up with another 2 employees from PGCPS so that you'll have an opportunity to unpack and discuss what we've read. I too will be reading and will be dropping into a few of those virtual experiences as we work together to begin to embrace and respect each other's culture. Have an amazing summer.